Bid started at $40. $40 for a 23-year-old woman who hadn't eaten in 2 days, whose wrists were wrapped in electrical tape because real rope had run out, and whose eyes had gone the particular kind of flat that only comes when a person has stopped expecting things to get better. Her name was Vivienne Dufresne, and she was standing in the back corner of a barn outside of Lac Saint-Jean, Quebec, in the middle of February, and she was being sold. The man doing the selling was named Auclair. He wasn't her father. He wasn't her uncle. He was the man her mother had left her with when Vivienne was 16, after the car accident took her mother and her mother's good judgment both at once. Auclair had kept her working his property for 7 years, cooking, cleaning, mending fences in weather that cracked her knuckles open. He hadn't hit her often, just enough to make sure she knew the shape of things. Now he owed money to people who didn't like waiting, and Vivienne was the most liquid asset he had. There were 4 men in the barn. One of them left after Auclair named the price, $40 Canadian, cash. Another laughed. The third made a counteroffer that Vivienne didn't hear clearly, because the blood was very loud in her ears at that point. The fourth man hadn't said anything yet. He was standing near the far wall, slightly apart from the others, with the particular stillness of someone who'd spent a long time in places where noise got you in trouble. His name was Dax Tremblay. He was 34 years old, a former forestry worker turned one-man carpentry operation who'd driven 4 hours from his property near Chibougamau because Auclair allegedly had timber equipment to sell. There was no timber equipment. There was just this. Dax looked at Vivienne once, a quick look, the kind that takes inventory, and then he looked at his boots for a long moment. Then he pulled 2 20s from his wallet and set them on the hay bale beside him without a word. Nobody else moved. Auclair swept up the money before anyone reconsidered. "She doesn't talk much," he said, which was the only thing he offered by way of introduction. Dax walked over to Vivienne. He didn't grab her arm, didn't touch her at all. He just stopped a few feet away and said, quietly, "My truck is outside. You don't have to come, but it's -22, and I've got heat." She came. They didn't speak for the first hour of driving. The truck was old, a 2003 F-250, with a crack in the dashboard and a pine tree air freshener that had long since stopped smelling like anything, and the heater worked well enough that Vivienne's fingers started to hurt as they thawed. She pressed them between her knees and watched the highway unspool through the dark. Dax drove with one hand on the wheel and didn't look at her. Somewhere past Robertville, he reached across and turned the heat up another notch without being asked. Vivienne noticed. She didn't say anything, but she noticed. An hour after that, she said, "Where are we going?" "My place," he said, "unless you have somewhere else." She didn't. "There's a spare room," he said. "You can stay there as long as you need. I'm not—" He stopped. Started again. "I just want to be clear. This isn't— I'm not expecting anything from you." Vivienne had heard variations of that sentence before, from men who revised their expectations the moment a door closed. She kept her face neutral and said nothing. Dax seemed to understand the silence because he didn't push it. He just drove. His property was 40 minutes off the highway, at the end of a road that was more theory than fact in February. There was a house, a real one, not a trailer, and a workshop attached to one side, and a woodpile stacked with the obsessive neatness of someone who'd been doing it alone for a long time. Inside was warm, clean without being sterile. There was a wood stove in the main room and a kitchen with mismatched chairs and a window over the sink that looked out into the dark of the boreal forest. Dax showed her the spare room. There was a bed with 2 wool blankets and a small lamp. There was a door that locked from the inside. He pointed out the lock. "Bathrooms across the hall," he said. "There should be a toothbrush under the sink, still in the package. He looked at the floor. "I'm sorry I don't have anything for you to wear. I've got flannel shirts. I can leave one outside the door." Vivienne stood in the middle of the small room and didn't know what to do with her hands. "Why did you do that?" she said. He knew what she meant. "I don't know," he said. which was the most honest answer she'd heard from a man in years. "I couldn't leave." He went to get the flannel shirt. She locked the door behind him. She sat on the bed and waited for her heart rate to come down. It took a while. The next morning she woke before him and didn't know what to do about that either. She stood in the kitchen in his too large flannel shirt and her own ruined jeans and tried to remember the last time she'd been somewhere that no one had told her what to do. She found coffee. She made it. When Dax came into the kitchen at 7:30, he stopped in the doorway at the sight of her standing at his stove. Something moved across his face. Not hunger. Nothing like that. Something more like surprise, and then sorrow, and then he got himself back together. "Thank you," he said, "about the coffee. I didn't know if you took anything in it." Black spine. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, and neither of them was good at it yet, but they tried. He asked if she was hungry. She said yes in a way that made it clear she'd had to override something to admit it, and he made eggs with the focused attention of someone performing a small but important task. She ate all of it. He refilled her plate without making a thing of it. The days had a rhythm he didn't impose and she didn't have to ask about. He was in the workshop by 8, sanding or cutting or assembling. She could hear it through the wall, the steady mechanical sounds of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. He came in at noon. He made lunch for 2 without discussion. He went back to the workshop. He came in for dinner. Vivienne cooked dinner, the first time, because she needed something to do with her hands, and because the alternative was sitting in the spare room, listening to the quiet, which was still unfamiliar enough to feel like a trap. Dax came in from the workshop at 6 and stopped at the smell of whatever was on the stove. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said, and kept stirring. He ate it. He said it was good. He washed the dishes after, without asking if she wanted him to. It was the strangest week of Vivienne's life, and nothing happened. Nothing bad, she meant. Nothing she needed to brace for. She kept waiting. She asked him, at the end of the first week, while they were both sitting with coffee after dinner, "When you get angry, do you get quiet first, or does it come fast?" Dax put his mug down. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she couldn't fully read. "I get quiet," he said finally. "I go to the workshop. And if the workshop isn't there?" "I've never not had a workshop of some kind," he said. He paused. "Why are you asking?" "I'm trying to figure out when to move," she said. Not out of his house. She meant out of the way. She said it matter-of-factly because it was a practical matter to her. The same way checking the weather before going outside was practical. You gathered information. You planned accordingly. The expression on his face, then, she'd see it later in her mind many times. Something in him went very still, the way a large animal goes still when it encounters something that surprises it. And then his eyes went a little bright, and he looked away, out the kitchen window, at the black February night. "Vivienne," he said, very carefully, "nobody's going to move at you here." She'd heard promises before, but there was something in his voice, not force, not insistence, just weight, the weight of something true. She didn't cry. She wasn't there yet. But she looked down at her coffee cup and said, "Okay." March came and the light changed, the way it does in northern Quebec. Not gradually, but in sudden jumps, like someone kept turning a dimmer up in increments while you weren't looking. Vivienne started going outside, first just to the woodpile, getting familiar with the property, then further following the trail into the tree line that Dax used for firewood runs. He didn't tell her to be careful. He didn't tell her anything. He just left a decent pair of snow boots by the door one morning, used but warm, roughly her size, and didn't mention them. She started to learn his silences. There were a few different kinds. There was the working silence, which was focused and complete and nothing to do with her. There was the thinking silence, which happened at mealtimes when he'd gone somewhere in his own head. And there was the careful silence, which was the one he used when he was trying to give her room without making it obvious that he was giving her room. She started to trust the careful silence most of all. One afternoon, she found him in the workshop, fitting a mortise joint on a cabinet he was making for someone in town. He was so absorbed that he didn't hear her come in. She stood in the doorway for a moment just watching, his hands moving with the kind of confidence that comes not from ease, but from 10,000 hours of practice. And something in her chest did a thing she didn't immediately have words for. She'd grown up believing that competence in men was dangerous, that when a man was good at something, that skill became a thing he used to establish the size of his authority. But watching Dax work was different. It was just craft, clean and private and not aimed at anyone. She backed out of the doorway before he noticed her. The first time Eau Claire called, she didn't know the number and didn't pick up. The second time, he left a voicemail that made her hand go cold around the phone. He used the particular tone he'd always used, reasonable, patient, the tone that said, "I'm not angry yet, but that's a condition, not a state," and said she'd taken something that belonged to him and that she should think carefully. She stood in the kitchen for a long moment after the voicemail ended. Then she deleted it. Then she went and found Dax in the workshop and said, "The man I was with," he called. Dax set down the tool he was holding. "What did he say?" She told him. Dax was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Did you want me to call him back?" "No." "Then I won't." He picked up the tool again. "If he shows up here, that's a different conversation. But he won't." "How do you know?" "Because men like that count on people being scared and far away and having nowhere to go," he said. "You're not far away anymore." She stood in the workshop doorway. "That's it? You're not going to tell me what to do?" "What would I tell you to do?" "Most people would tell me to go to the police, or leave, or that I shouldn't have." She stopped. "Shouldn't have what?" She didn't answer. He didn't push. "I don't have a plan for you," he said after a moment. "I just have a spare room and enough food." He looked at her steadily. "That's what I've got." Vivienne felt something loosen in her throat. Just slightly. Just enough. April turned the road outside back into a road, and with the mud season came the sense that the world was resuming something. Dax started getting more orders. Word of mouth, apparently, from the cabinet job. And Vivienne, who had been restless in the particular way of someone accustomed to constant work and given too much stillness, started helping in the workshop. She didn't ask. She just came in one morning when he was trying to sand a tabletop and hold it in place simultaneously, and she held it. He looked up. "I've got 2 hands," she said. So she held the tabletop. And the next day she came back. And the day after that, he showed her how to use the orbital sander, which she took to with a focus that made him step back and watch. "You've done this before," he said. "Not this, but I've fixed things." She kept sanding. When something breaks, you fix it yourself, or it stays broken. That was the rule. Dax said nothing. She was learning that his silences were sometimes responses. She glanced up at him. "What?" "Nothing," he said. "You're good at it." The compliment landed strangely. She didn't know where to put it, and it sat in her chest for the rest of the day, awkward and warm. What she hadn't expected was that she would miss him when he was gone. He'd gone into Chibougamau for supplies one Tuesday and wouldn't be back until evening, and she'd known that in advance, and it was fine. But by mid-afternoon, the house had a different quality to it. Not frightening, just absent. She caught herself listening for the sound of the workshop, and when it wasn't there, the silence had a different texture. She sat with that for a while. She understood what it meant. She wasn't naive. But she also understood that she was a woman who'd spent the last 7 years in a situation that had recalibrated every one of her instincts, and she trusted those recalibrated instincts about almost nothing when it came to men. Except she kept coming back to the lock on the bedroom door, which she had used at first every night, and then some nights, and then only when the anxiety crept up bad enough. And now, if she was being honest with herself, almost never. Not because she'd lowered her guard, but because he'd never, in 4 months, given her a reason to raise it. Dax came home that Tuesday with the supplies and a bag from the bakery in town, which he set on the counter without ceremony and said was because they'd had the good kind, and did she want any? She said yes. They ate pastry at the kitchen table as the evening came in through the windows, and he told her about a conversation he'd had at the hardware store, something small and absurd about a misquoted measurement, and she laughed, actually laughed, a short, surprised sound, and then looked slightly startled by it. He looked at her carefully. "That's the first time I've heard you laugh," he said. "I laugh," she said. "Not so I've noticed." She looked at the pastry in her hand. "I used to," she said. "I used to laugh a lot, actually, before." She paused. "I had a life before, you know. Friends. I used to make people laugh, too." She said it simply, not with grief exactly, but with the precision of someone locating a thing they'd put down and forgotten. Dax was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Tell me about before." And she did. Not all of it, not yet, but some of it. About growing up in Chicoutimi, about her mother's garden and the particular smell of it in July, about her best friend from school who'd moved to Vancouver and sent voice memos because she hated texting, about wanting, at 15, to be a marine biologist, which was funny because the nearest ocean was 12 hours away. Dax listened the way he did everything, completely and without crowding her. When she finished, he said, "You could still." She looked up. "Marine biology," he said. "Well, whatever. You're 23. He said it without fanfare, like it was a simple fact and not the most foreign concept she'd encountered in years. She didn't say anything, but she looked at him for a long moment. This quiet man in his kitchen with sawdust on his flannel, who'd paid $40 for a woman at an auction and asked nothing in return except that she not sleep in the cold, and she thought, "I have absolutely no idea what to do with you." Eau Claire came in the second week of May. She saw the truck first, from the kitchen window, an unfamiliar vehicle turning onto the property road, and she recognized the particular tightening in her body before she recognized the truck itself. 7 years of training. Her body knew the shape of that threat before her mind caught up. She found Dax in the workshop. She said his name. He looked up and saw her face and put down the chisel. "What is it?" "He's here." Dax nodded once, the way someone nods when they've already thought through a thing and knows what comes next. He came out of the workshop, not hurrying, not performing calm, but actually calm, and stood in the yard as Eau Claire's truck came to a stop. Eau Claire got out. He was smiling, his negotiating smile, the one that didn't reach his eyes. "Just coming to talk," he said. "Then talk," said Dax. Eau Claire looked past him at Vivienne, who was standing slightly behind and to the left, and something shifted in his face. The assessment of a man calculating whether he still had leverage. "She's mine," he said, not angrily, conversationally, as if it were a plain fact. "I need her back. You got your money's worth for 4 months." "She's not yours," Dax said. Same conversational tone. "She was never yours, and she's not going anywhere." "I've got papers," Eau Claire said. "Guardianship papers from when she was 16. She never." "She's 23, Dax said. Guardianship expires at 18. You know that. You're just counting on her not knowing it." A pause. Eau Claire looked at Vivienne again. The smile stayed on his face, but something behind it recalculated. "Vivienne," he said, like they were old friends, "don't you want to come home?" She was aware of Dax standing beside her, not in front, not shielding her, not making himself a wall. Beside. It was a small thing that meant everything. "No," she said. One word. She'd practiced larger speeches in her head over the last 7 years. Elaborate, watertight arguments, every counterpoint anticipated and defused. In the end, it was just the one word. "No." Eau Claire stood there for another moment. Then he got back in his truck. She didn't breathe again until the truck had turned back down the property road and disappeared into the tree line. Dax exhaled beside her. Not like he'd been scared. She'd realized later that he genuinely hadn't been, or not of Eau Claire, but like a thing had been resolved. "He won't be back," he said. "How do you know?" "Because the thing he was selling was the idea that you had nowhere else to be," he said. "He can see that's not true anymore." She stood in the yard and felt the May sun on her face and thought, not true anymore. There was a night in June when the light stayed until almost 10, and the forest had that particular smell, pine and meltwater and something else, living and green, and Vivienne was sitting on the front step because she'd needed air, and Dax came out and sat beside her. Not close, a few feet away. The distance he always maintained, giving her the choice of the space between them. They sat there for a while. "I'm going to call her," Vivienne said. "My friend, the one in Vancouver." "Yeah? I think I've been—" She picked at the edge of her thumbnail. "I think I've been putting it off because I'd have to explain. And I don't know how to explain it." "You don't have to explain anything," he said. "She's your friend." Vivienne thought about that. She's going to ask where I've been, what happened. Then tell her. Or don't. Your call. She's going to want to know if I'm okay. She paused. "And I'm going to have to figure out if that's true." Dax was quiet for a moment. Then, "Are you?" She looked at the tree line. The sun was doing something extraordinary to the tops of the spruce trees, turning them amber and gold. She breathed in the pine smell and thought about her mother's garden in July, and the voice memos from Vancouver, and the orbit of her own strange, unlikely life that had deposited her, of all places, here. "I think I'm getting there," she said. He nodded, didn't add anything. That was the thing about him that she had finally stopped being suspicious of, the way he never pushed past what was true. She said getting there, and he didn't need it to be already arrived. He could sit with the in-between. She shifted slightly on the step. The distance between them decreased by a few inches. He didn't move away. They sat there as the light finally, slowly gave out, the forest going from gold to gray to the particular soft dark of a Canadian summer night, and neither of them needed it to be anything other than what it was. A step. A beginning. The kind that doesn't announce itself, that just accumulates quietly, the way trust does, the way warmth does, the way the things worth keeping always do. I keep thinking about the moment Vivienne asked Dax whether he hit with a closed fist or an open hand. Not because it's shocking, though it is, but because of what it tells you about how a person learns to survive. She wasn't asking out of fear in that moment. She was asking out of habit. 7 years of gathering information, reading rooms, calculating distances. That's not weakness. That's a kind of intelligence that gets built in the hardest school there is, the one where the lessons come without warning and the cost of getting it wrong is immediate. What I've come to believe, sitting with this story, is that the things we call strength and the things we call damage are often the same thing, wearing different clothes depending on the weather. Vivienne had sharpened herself into someone who could read a room in seconds, who could anticipate, who could endure. That same sharpness is what made her watch Dax for weeks before she trusted the quiet. It's what made her hold the tabletop steady on the first try. It's what put her body between Dax and Eau Claire when it mattered. She didn't stop being who the hard years had made her. She just found a place where those same qualities could mean something other than survival. And Dax, I think about what it took for him to do what he did, not just the $40 in the barn, but everything after. The boots left by the door without comment. The lock he pointed out. The decade of silences he never weaponized. There's a kind of decency that doesn't announce itself, that just shows up in the small decisions no one's watching you make. That's not nothing. In a world that rewards the loudest version of everything, that kind of quiet integrity is genuinely hard to hold on to. He held on to it. The law of cause and effect in this story isn't tidy. Eau Claire didn't get dragged away in handcuffs. There was no dramatic reckoning. What happened was simpler and, I think, truer. The thing he had was the idea that Vivienne had nowhere else to be. When that stopped being true, he had nothing. The ground shifted under him, not because someone pushed him, but because she stood up. That's how it usually works. Not a single confrontation, but a slow accumulation of someone becoming more themselves, until the people who needed them, small, can't find purchase anymore. I think about perseverance differently after sitting with this. Not as gritting your teeth through something, though sometimes it's exactly that, but also as the quieter version, the decision made again and again in small ways to keep the door open. Vivienne calling her friend in Vancouver, taking the orbital sander and learning something new, sitting on the front step and letting the distance between herself and another person decrease by a few inches. None of that is dramatic. All of it is brave. What I take from her story is that healing doesn't arrive. It accumulates. And sometimes the person who helps it accumulate isn't the one who fixes you. It's the one who simply doesn't break you further and gives you enough room to remember what you were before the damage. Vivienne remembered. She'd wanted to be a marine biologist at 15. She'd made people laugh. She'd had a life with texture and color and a mother's garden in July. None of that was gone. It was just waiting for the right weather to come back.